The door was the color of dust, and it groaned every time it opened, one long breath in, one long breath out, as if the building itself had learned to sigh at the sight of the queue. At the arrondissement registry of Koura North, a woman named Aisha held a toddler who had not yet learned to answer to his own name because the state had not yet learned to recognize him. The child slept, lips chapped, belly tight from the clinic's refusal the day before. No vaccination without a number. No number without a birth certificate. No certificate without a fee that kept changing each time the door groaned. Everything good began on the other side of that gate. School, care, inheritance, the right to complain. Everything bad arranged itself neatly on this side. Whispers of facilitation, a tin box for photocopies, a clerk's lowered eyes. A brass plaque over the counter said, Ministry of Civic Identities in 3 languages. The smallest one in French, the rest in the languages of rain and millet. The fluorescent lights bucked once, then steadied. An official with a blue lanyard adjusted his badge and recited receipts like a prayer. It was almost a choreography, a request, a delay, a price that rose like heat off the pavement. In line behind Aicha, a driver fidgeted with a stack of crumpled CFAs and a folded letter from his employer that said, Urgent, in red. The ledger on the desk, the one that was supposed to be a promise, held more corrections than entries. Ink was a kind of smoke here. It could make things disappear. A junior clerk named Awa Sawadogo stood at a side table, her hands stained from carbon paper. She had learned to read the air, to hear the difference between a person who could absorb another day of rejection and one whose life was already leaning. She slipped an extra form under the glass to a grandmother whose eyes were clouds. She was not a hero, just stubborn. The breath before billing, she thought. Let them breathe first. She would say those words later, when it mattered. Beyond Koura North, the capital's ring roads pulsed with motos and late rains. The leader, his friends called him Ibrahim after a grandfather who never raised his voice and never had to, walked hallways that smelled of onions and toner. He read every night by the blue light of a tablet. Mortality tables, enrollment gaps, the price of cement, the little ways a country's pulse can be felt at the wrist of a registry. He moved without an entourage when he could. On his desk was a small stone from the river where he learned to swim. It kept his decisions heavy enough to resist the wind. Between Ibrahim and the line at Koura North stood a man who wore suits like armor. Advisor to the leader, special envoy for administrative modernization, all titles clipped clean along the edges. His name was Karim Doumbia, and he was the kind of person who never waited at doors because doors opened toward him. He spoke in the shorthand of conferences and tender documents, interoperability, vendor consolidation, accelerated rollout. He had a proposal thick enough to make a thud when laid on a table. And he promised the registry's pain could be solved if only the right partners were allowed to help. Discretions granted, pilots launched before skeptics woke. Early that week, a leak brushed through WhatsApp like wildfire, screenshots with timestamps. A number saved as KD cabinet, a sly emoji next to a line about guaranteeing proximity to the leader. The message looked like gossip until it tasted like metal on the tongue. In a tea house off Avenue des Martyrs, a radio host named Papa Idris held the printouts as if they might burn him. He went live at dusk and, with the careful voice of a man who knew walls had ears, described a rumor without naming the river. An advisor offering to sell what the people already owned, the leader's ear and the nation's patience. The call-in lines strained. In Koura North, the door sighed again. Awa glanced up as 2 men with soft shoes walked past the queue and into the back office, where Director Sana kept a calendar thicker than the law. She saw the way his hand hovered over the ledger before settling, the way authority left fingerprints even when you wore gloves. She watched the child on Aicha's shoulder stir, then quiet, then stir. The building exhaled. By nightfall, Ibrahim had the screenshots on his tablet and a silence he cultivated at moments like this, the silence in which you can hear the mechanics of a gate. He turned the stone in his palm and decided not to sleep. He would go to the registry in the morning, not to be filmed, not to perform, but to place his breath next to theirs and see who tried to bill him for it. The decision moved through the house like the first rain on tin, and the night tilted toward a reckoning. Morning in Koura North arrived with puddles that shone like coins. The registry door was already sighing, and the queue had grown a tail that wrapped around the fence where posters promised modernity in colors that had faded under 2 harmatans. Ibrahim came without the convoy and stood where the line bent, cap low, mask plain. He watched. A woman was told to come back with a husband. A boy was told to come back with a father. A foreigner in threadbare sandals was told to come back with a bribe he could call a service fee. Language bent at the counter like a reed. Director Sana, a bureaucrat whose smile came rationed, kept the ledger near the edge of his desk and the stamp face down, heavy as a threat. He had discovered long ago that the state was a series of doors, and each door had a price. A little here for the photocopy that never fed into a machine. A little there for the express lane that used the same hallway but had a faster shuffle. He had a nephew in procurement and a cousin in external relations. He had learned to sit still and let errands come to him. The WhatsApp leak metastasized. The screenshots were joined by voice notes, each more breathless than the last, the vowels rounded by fear, the consonants clipped by rage. In one, a middleman described packaging access. In another, a colleague warned that the leader's plan to decouple birth registration from hospital billing would be parked until partners found alignment, the word partners stretching like elastic over too many hands. Then came the telegram dump, a PDF marked confidential that mapped the rollout of a new biometric system to a consultancy headquartered 4 time zones away, with a clause that routed conflicts to an arbitration chamber the public would never see. A seal was half visible on the edge of one page, like a fingerprint left careless. Awa heard about the leaks in the small way that news arrives to those without antennae. Fragments in a break room where the kettle struggled, murmurs in the queue. A cousin who drove a moto and listened to radio between fares. She watched as the line shifted from impatience to vigilance. People started photographing the fees list with their phones. They began to whisper to each other about the numbers that did not add up. A child named Yoro mimicked the stamp sound with his mouth and made half the room laugh, the other half wince. Karim Doumbia did not appear rattled. He widened his circle instead. He promised a selection committee he could deliver world-class vendors. He promised a committee chair he could deliver the leader's signature. He promised a vendor he could deliver a pilot site or two where cameras would capture the right angles. The words he used were pillows, soft enough to muffle dissent. He told a confidant that governance was not about truth, but sequencing, and that he, more than anyone, understood the order in which things must happen. Breath could wait. Billing could not. In the president's office, a truth-telling aide named Mariam Diallo laid the printouts without drama. She described the messages linked to Karim as allegations that could be false or mixed true with poison. She said the word like a physician, yet she also traced the contour of harm if they were true. She pulled up the draft decree on Ibrahim's screen, the one that would decree the first breath rule, issuing temporary identity numbers at birth clinics and registries without prepayment or guarantors, with fees settled later through a treasury postage system. She pointed to the paragraph that had been bracketed, then delayed, then rewritten by someone who understood how to kill a reform without appearing to touch it. Every policy has a pulse, she said. This one is fainting. In Cora North, the tide turned mean. A man in a leather belt whispered to Director Sana, with the tight smile of someone who knew wages and favors by their first names. The director's stamp moved faster, then stopped when he saw a quiet man in a plain cap watching him from the queue. Something about the stare removed the oxygen from the room. The director reached for a bottle of sanitizer he never used and pretended to clean his hands. The queue held its breath. On the radio, Papa Idris took calls from truck drivers and midwives, farmers and teachers. A voice from the north said the registry in his town had started charging tea money for a certificate that once cost the price of a loaf. Another voice described how an officer in a green uniform had folded a banknote into a pocket as neat as origami. Idris made no accusations. He asked questions and let silence answer them. He reminded listeners, gently, that the leader had promised to open doors without selling keys. The phone blinked like an alarm. By afternoon, the screenshots reached Ibrahim's mother's phone. She did not call. She never did during storms. Instead, she sent a single line, "Do not let anyone tax their breath." He looked at the stone on his desk, a darker shade now, as if it had absorbed the day. He asked Mariam how long it would take to pivot from decree to order to enforcement. She answered with a timeline precise enough to hurt. He asked her if she trusted the audit office. She said she trusted the young ones, who were still embarrassed by their own power. He stood and told her they were going to Cora North at first light, not to be seen, but to see. He wanted to hear a door breathe. They arrived before the registry opened, when the street vendors were still blowing ash off their charcoal, and the muezzin's last note clung to the air. Ibrahim taken for a teacher on leave, a cap shielding recognition. Mariam moving like a shadow at his shoulder. Awa, early by habit, found them leaning against the fence where the posters peeled in long tongues. She didn't know him yet. She knew the posture of someone who had come to listen. She told them the rules of the gate as if she were explaining weather, the fee that wasn't a fee, the officer help that wasn't help, the language that changed when you asked for a receipt. She said, breath, without noticing, and Ibrahim watched the word enter the day like a sparrow that knows its route. He stepped inside when the door exhaled the first time. The room recognized him in ripples. Director Sana stood too quickly, smile torn from the wrapper. He gestured to chairs that had never felt the weight of anyone from this side of the building. Ibrahim stayed standing. He asked for the ledger. He asked for the list of fees. He asked for the policy circulars that governed the registry's discretion. He did not raise his voice. He raised the floor beneath their feet and held it steady. The decisive act was a small one. He took out a pen and on the counter, between the glass and the wood, wrote a line he had practiced in his sleep. First breath rule. Issue temporary number. First, documents and fees later. He said it the way you teach a child a prayer. He repeated it to Acha, who had returned to the queue because habits are stubborn. He repeated it to Yoro, who mimicked the stamp sound and then stopped as if learning a new toy. He repeated it to Director Sana, who said this would cause chaos, that the Treasury needed guarantees, that the database would become a sieve. Miriam, who carried the book of the decree in her spine, answered, Treasury will fund via a postage transfer with a monthly cap per site, she said. Lists of temporary numbers will be posted to the public dashboard each evening with 3 indicators. Door-to-number minutes, denials in last 24 hours, complaints resolved on time. A hotline on USSD and WhatsApp will take complaints, and the SLA is 2 business days. No refuse for lack of payment, not at the door. Let people breathe first, then settle accounts with the state like adults. She spoke softly, but the words had edges. Ibrahim turned to the line and told them this. The state will not sell you entry into itself. If anyone charges you to let a child exist on paper, report it. We will protect you. He pointed to a young guard at the door, a man whose uniform had been washed too often, and asked his name. Benoit, the guard said, startled. They gave Benoit a sheet of paper and a stamp, and Ibrahim wrote 3 words above it, complaint intake log, then signed the margin like a witness. He asked Awa to train Benoit to log names, numbers, and the time a complaint was taken. He told Director Sana that he would personally return, unannounced, to read the log and compare it to the dashboard. The stamp in Sana's hand seemed heavier now, as if the ink had turned to sand. The next act was larger. Ibrahim called the national broadcaster from the courtyard and asked to speak at noon. No motorcade, no anthem. When the cameras arrived, he stood with the registry door in frame and said, the first breath rule allowed. Offering no history lesson, no epigraph, only the simple decision that would reorder the sequence of care and justice. He said the rule extended to birth clinics and mobile caravans where midwives carried the state on their hips. No baby would leave unseen by the ledger. He said the government would publish KPIs at 6 p.m. daily. Door-to-number minutes, denials in last 24 hours, complaints resolved. He said expediter fees were banned. He said salaries would increase by a modest fixed amount funded not by service fees, but by a treasury that found its courage. He said one more thing that made phones quiet. Those who tax breath will be asked to account for their own. At the same hour, his staff delivered sealed letters to the Audit Office and the Public Ethics Commission. He asked them to open an investigation into leak allegations surrounding the consultant's route, and to trace the edits that had bracketed the decree. He asked, too, for a risk-based audit of 3 registries with high denial rates and to publish the methodology. He signed with the stone Waters patience, then looked up at the door, which sighed again. The day had a new rule, and the room learned how to hold it. By evening, the dashboard went live with a simple interface that even old phones could load. It showed Cora North at 32 minutes door-to-number, down from an invisible baseline. Denials held at 3, 2 of them revised by closing time. Complaints resolved. 1 with a note that said, fee refunded. The comments section under the broadcaster's post filled like a well. Some praised, some doubted. Many screenshotted the metrics and shared them downstream. At the registry door, a mother breathed without counting her coins first, and her child watched the stamp go down on a form that felt less like smoke. The gate, for once, swung on the people's side. Investigations are made of dull hours and sharp edges. The Ethics Commission began with the ledger and the log. They requested printouts from the Cora North dashboard and the 2 other sites with suspect denial rates. They asked to see the fee schedules that had multiplied like photocopies of a rumor. The Audit Office assigned 2 young examiners, Fanta and Ismail, who still believed forms could carry truth if held up to the light. They carried clipboards and wore masks that fogged, and they asked everyone the same question. Show me where it says you can charge for air. They followed trails, not with intuition, but with receipts. They pulled the bank statements of the Friends of the Registry Association, which apparently existed to improve staff morale, but in practice, aggregated small payments that sat just under the reporting threshold. They mapped phone calls between Director Sana and a procurement cousin who had a taste for couriered envelopes. They matched the timing of edits to the decree with entries in the cabinet visitor log. At 11:13 a.m. on a Tuesday, a note appeared in the draft. Bracket clause 5.2, until partners align. At 11:16, a call from Kareem's number to an international line. At 11:22, a screenshot of a calendar invite labeled alignment. Kareem responded, like a veteran of storms. He issued a statement about complexities. He proposed an independent commission staffed by people who owed him dinners. He hinted that the leader's zeal might scare off investors, as if the country's pulse were a market to be bid. He met with a vendor whose logo looked like a soothing wave and promised that the sequencing would be respected. Pilot first in friendly districts, then expansion after lessons learned, all dependent on a confidentiality clause that would keep the public dashboard a toy. He smiled when he spoke because the cameras wanted teeth. Miriam went toward the noise and passed it. She obtained chat logs through legal channels, some blurred by lawyers, enough to see the bones. A group called Fast Track, where middlemen traded notes on who answered what number at what hour. A sticker of a door sent whenever a meeting opened for deals. A code word, oxygen. When someone needed cash to calm a sudden moral crisis, she moved the logs to a secure server and began cross-referencing against the audit's timeline. Her desk became the place where the pattern tightened. Always complaint log, and Cora North, meanwhile, did quiet work. Names appeared in neat block letters, numbers with too many digits tamed by training. She logged not only the complaint, but the minute the breath went out of a caller. A father who was told to pay for a form that had already been paid for. A widow who was told to bring her dead husband to sign. Each entry a door closing, each resolution a door nudged open. At the bottom of the page, she wrote resolved refund or resolved apology, and once, with a satisfaction that warmed her fingers. Resolved, policy clarified to staff by director in front of Q. She let that ink dry slowly. When the commission called Director Sana to testify, he arrived in a suit, a shade darker than worry. He carried his smile like an umbrella. He told them he deplored any insinuation of wrongdoing, and that his staff worked under great pressure. He said any extra fees were misunderstandings born of underfunded operations. He said he welcomed the leader's zeal, said zeal as if he were declining a second serving, though he regretted the immediate nature of the reform. The commissioners asked him to read aloud Clause 3.1 of the existing regulation. He read, "The registry shall issue provisional identity when supporting documents are in process, without undue delay or condition." The word condition clanged. Then came the moment that shifted the room. Ismail slid a photocopy across the table. It was a letter on letterhead from a consultancy abroad, thanking Mr. KD for facilitating discussions, and noting their understanding that the government would postpone any public-facing metrics until after the pilot, to avoid misinterpretation, by citizens and press. It was signed in a hand that looked like hurry. The letter didn't prove a crime. It proved an intent to draw the curtains and sell the moonlight. Fanta followed with a bank deposit list, small deposits over 6 months into a family account attached to Sana's nephew, each accompanied by references like tea, thanks, or a single door emoji. Ibrahim did not gloat. He went on television at dusk with the registry door behind him again, and spoke the facts in a voice that would have fit in a library. He explained the pattern, a bracketed clause that would have suffocated the first breath rule, an advisor who introduced vendors before introducing principals, a director who taxed the act of entering the state. He said the investigation would continue and the courts would do their work. He emphasized the system, not the men, because he knew men were replaceable and doors were not. He said something simple and new. "We will name the mechanisms, not the rumors." Kareem watched from a room with air conditioning that hummed like denial. His phone showed his own name in the scrawl of a foreign executive, and for the first time in years, his hands did not know where to rest. He called allies. The calls did not connect. He looked at a badge that used to open any door and saw it for what it was. A rented keyring. He prepared a statement about misunderstanding and malice, but no one was listening to nouns. The country had trained its ear to the sound of a door changing its hinge. Reform, done right, is boring in the body and thrilling in the bone. The first breath rule moved from decree to habit by means of simple repetitions that made vanity itch. Every registry began the day with a drill so plain it was almost mockery. A clerk issued a dummy temporary number to a colleague without papers, then logged it to the dashboard from a basic phone, then practiced saying, "We'll settle fees later. For now, breathe." The exercise took 5 minutes. It was mandatory. They called it the morning breath. The dashboard stabilized with 3 bold lines that people learned to read the way fishermen read tides. Door to number minutes in blue. Denials in the last 24 hours in black. Complaints resolved within SLA in green. The colors carried through to posters taped to registry walls. No glossy frames, just tape and stubbornness. Each evening at 6, the numbers refreshed. Each morning, a clerk somewhere bragged to a cousin that their site had cut the blue line in half. Children learned to point at the lines and ask questions. Radio hosts learned to recite them in jingles that stuck. The perverse incentive was not shamed. It was replaced. Expedite fees were outlawed with a 1-syllable word. In their place came a clean path, a monthly transfer from the Treasury to registries based on volume weighted by equity, with a modest performance bump if the blue line fell while the black line did not rise and the green line kept its promise. The formula fit on a single page. It did not wink. It did not bend for uncles. It did not starve the honest to feed the hungry corrupt. An audit firm chosen by lottery reviewed the transfers quarterly and published a 2-page note that people could read without a lawyer nearby. Complaint channels grew teeth. The USSD code was short enough to memorize and forgiving of fat fingers. The WhatsApp number replied with autoprompts in 3 languages and stored voice notes for those who trusted their mouths more than their thumbs. Each complaint got a case number, each case number a timer. 2 days was the SLA. If a site missed the deadline twice in a month, a red dot appeared on the dashboard next to its name, and the dot did something shame could not do alone. It made directors pick up the phone and apologize. The Ethics Commission met complaints where they lived, dispatching junior staff with dignity that they wore like uniforms. Training was humble. No laminated certificates, no PowerPoint in the dark. They made a pocket guide small enough to fit behind an ID card. Breath before billing. 3 steps printed as if they were phone contacts. Step 1, issue provisional identity. Step 2, log it to the dashboard. Step 3, explain the fee settlement path. Awa helped write the guide, and she insisted on a 4th line in smaller font. I'll look at the person as if the state remembers them. She watched as the guide frayed from use and hid her pride under jokes about her handwriting. Karim appeared before a judge. He came in through the front door like everyone else, and he learned the feel of a wooden bench that didn't care about your titles. He protested misunderstanding and malice. His lawyer invoked context and efficiency. The court focused on mechanism. Ethics violations were adjudicated in daylight. The outcomes were less cinematic than the rumors deserved and more useful. Fines that stung rather than ruined. Bans from procurement committees that closed the right doors. A probation term that included training hours he had to sit through like everyone else. The world had expected a purge. Ibrahim refused theatrics. He wanted the system to hum, not howl. Director Sana resigned. It was not dramatic. He wrote a letter that said, "New challenges," and cleaned his desk of a family photo and an old stamp that had not been his to keep. He left through the same door he had once taxed, and he nodded to Benoit, who logged his exit with a little flourish of the pen. A young woman named Fatu took Sana's chair. She asked for nothing but fresh ledgers and honest brooms. She took the morning drill seriously and looked up from the dashboard. Numbers often enough to remember the shape of a child's face on his mother's shoulder. Mariam built an integrity calendar, a monthly ritual in which sites pulled a random complaint from the past month, read it aloud, walked it through its resolution, and then asked the room what they could have done to shorten it by a breath. The meetings were awkward at first, then useful in the way that straight-back chairs are useful. The integrity calendar went up on the wall next to the fan. Each tick of the months turned a policy into a habit, each habit into a culture that outlived its authors. By the end of the quarter, door-to-number minutes had dropped by 39% across the capital. Denials dipped and then flattened, a kind of truce. Complaints resolved within SLA rose until the green line looked like a runway at dusk. Radio jingles normalized the language of the dashboard. The registry door still groaned. It was old wood, but it was no longer a throat-clearing for extortion. When Ibrahim visited unannounced, he found Aicha picking up a printed card with her child's temporary number, a slip of paper like a seed packet. She did not see him. She did not need to. She walked out into the dust with a document that fit in her palm and a boy who would learn his name in school, free of the price of entry. The reform held under the weight of ordinary life, which is the only test that matters. Months turned systems into furniture. The registry's new rhythms became background noise, like the hum of a refrigerator or the far-off bark of a dog at night. The blue line on the dashboard found a level that people recognized and barely glanced at unless it misbehaved. The black line stayed low, and its stutters drew curiosity rather than panic. The green line became the pride of clerks who were not born to be heroes, but knew the satisfaction of promises kept on time. Children learned the USSD code the way their parents had learned soccer chants for the joy of being part of something that worked. The first breath rule traveled. A customs post at the eastern border hung a poster that read, "Clear first, levy later," for small traders whose goods had sat in sun until their profits melted. A municipal clinic adopted "Stitch first, bill later" on afternoons when moto accidents raised the dust. A school enrollment tent at the edge of a seasonal camp printed "Seat first, paper later." And the head teacher kept a little ledger on the desk where he wrote not just names but the time each child found their chair. The motif, breath before billing, became a way of seeing doors and insisting they open in the right order. Papa Idris's radio program grew quiet in a new way. Fewer callers arrived with blood pressure in their throats. He found himself interviewing a clerk about how to keep ledgers dry during the rains, and a guard about the best shade for a bench. He missed the heat sometimes, the way a retired boxer misses the bell, but he recognized the nobility of boredom. He aired a weekly segment called Gatekeepers Who Keep Gates Open, and listeners sent in voice notes praising clerks who explained forms without sighing, porters who carried strollers, janitors who wiped down the counter between customers. The show's tagline shifted from a growl to a vow. Kareem kept his head down. He taught a seminar about sequencing for integrity at the university, where students asked pointed questions with the courtesy of future adults. He stopped describing people as stakeholders and started calling them by their names. Once, leaving a classroom, he saw the pocket guide in a student's wallet and felt the strange relief of not being needed by something that worked. He paused at the registry on his way home, not to be seen, not to perform, but to watch. When the door sighed, it sounded like something exhaling tension it had held too long. Ibrahim visited his mother on a Sunday. She had made millet cakes and tea strong enough to correct posture. They ate in silence for a while, then played with numbers on a napkin, blue, black, green. He kept the stone on the windowsill now, where sunlight warmed it. His mother nodded at the dashboard like it was a well-kept house. "You cannot shock the world by shouting at it," she said. "You shock it by making decency look inevitable." He smiled and remembered the morning the pen scratched. The words "first breath rule" onto a counter. Scarred by rings and impatience, Awa became supervisor of front counters across 3 districts. She wore the title like a sweater, sleeves pushed up. She visited sites carrying a small notebook and a question she asked everywhere. Where does the breath catch? The answers were never identical. Some gates stuck at lunch. Others failed at shift change. She adjusted staffing. She adjusted hours to match the sun rather than a memo. She put complaint intake log sheets in places where dignity felt comfortable. She kept her own ledger private, a list of names whose patience she did not want to waste again. Once a month, she led the integrity calendar meeting in a circle with no head. Benoit married, grew a small belly, and saved to buy a better pen because he'd discovered he cared about how logs looked. He trained new guards with 2 rules: write legibly and never let your uniform make you taller than the person you serve. He kept a whistle in his pocket that he rarely used and a folded piece of paper with the USSD code in case someone's battery died. He found that keeping a door open was less about strength than about timing and listening, a wrist more than a shoulder. The registry itself changed without drama. Fresh paint dulled the groan of the door. New chairs made the queue straighter, then shorter. A water cooler appeared near the entrance with cups stacked neatly, a small rebellion against the tyranny of thirst. The poster with the dashboard lines was replaced once when the tape gave out. The wall beneath showed the outline where good intentions had stuck. The ledger was still a ledger, thick and literal, but the handwriting improved. Names were spelled with care, as if the act of writing them carried a blessing. There were still bad days. A network outage. A clerk who remembered the thrill of an extra envelope. A vendor who promised the moon again. The system shrugged and absorbed it. Complaints triggered calls. Calls triggered apologies. Apologies triggered small, stubborn fixes that felt like sewing a seam rather than cutting a new suit. The metrics held their shape. The monthly audit notes pointed at corners dust had tried to collect. The culture checked itself the way a person checks their breath before speaking in a quiet room. On a late afternoon at Cora North, under a sky the color of damp paper, a group of mothers stood under the eaves comparing baby photos on phones with cracked glass. Aisha laughed at a joke that had no villain in it. Inside, a clerk slid a provisional card across the counter with the ease of a routine, and a guard logged a resolved complaint with a small flourish. Outside, the door sighed. The sound was different now, less weary, more like a house settling. The breath was free. The billing could wait. The habit had formed, and the world, if it had been watching, would not have been shocked anymore. It would have nodded and said, as good neighbors say when something right endures, that this is simply how we live now. And that's our story of doors that finally opened and breaths no one can tax again. If this journey moved you, stand with us as we keep telling hard, necessary truths. If you liked the video, then like, share, comment, and subscribe. Your voice widens the circle, your click keeps the lights on, and together we turn one good rule into a living habit.